Welcome, everybody. It's such a pleasure to have you all here at the British Foreign Policy Group. My name is Sophia Gaston. I'm the director here. It is such a pleasure and an honour to be here with His Excellency, the Honourable George Brandis, who is the Australian High Commissioner to the UK. George has been in this post for 4 years, and it's spanned quite a turbulent time, not just here in the UK, but also in the wider European region, and of course, in terms of broader geopolitical developments. And I think it's fair to say that the bilateral relationship is in pretty good shape at the moment, actually, and a lot of that is very much due to the efforts of George and his tireless enthusiasm and energy. And as he will be leaving us in London pretty soon, I just want to take this moment at the beginning today just to acknowledge that for all of those, including myself, at the stake in this relationship, we're very grateful for your service, and it's feeling like we are starting to move into a really ambitious place for the bilateral relationship. I also want to acknowledge George's wonderful team who have been really essential in moving things forward behind the scenes. We're going to have a chance for questions later, so please, while we're talking, have a think about what you might wish to ask. We're just going to start with a relaxed conversation between George and I. The topic of today's session is to talk about the future of alliances and liberal democracy and where we think the world order is going. And we're obviously speaking at a time with some pretty shocking developments in our European neighborhood here. But I'd like to just start with some reflections about the bilateral relationship. As I mentioned, this term that you've had here in London has been characterized by an extraordinary amount of dynamism politically in the UK, also geostrategically. I'd like you to reflect on your conception of the role when you were first appointed, and maybe how you've had to evolve your priorities over that term in response to that pretty rapidly shifting landscape.
Well, it has been a good afternoon, Sophia. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It has been a pretty rapidly shifting landscape. You're right. I mean, when Malcolm Turnbull, the then Australian Prime Minister, asked me to do this job, the biggest priority was to get a free trade agreement done between Australia and the United Kingdom, and that has now happened, subject to parliamentary approval. But I thought that's what would be the main task. It's been an important part of the job. I don't for a moment mean to suggest that it's been other than one of the core things that the last 4 years have been devoted to. But there have been other issues that have come onto the agenda in a way that 4 years ago I wouldn't have anticipated, either as a result of deliberate decisions by government, which AUKUS, I suppose, is the best example, or as a result of entirely unforeseen circumstances, obviously the pandemic. And from a diplomatic missions point of view, that was a multidimensional challenge, because obviously there was the public health crisis in Australia, which we engaged with the United Kingdom government to help us to address when we had a vaccine shortage last year. But also the consular crisis, that I mean, that sounds dull, but it's really important that there were so many Australians who were stranded in the United Kingdom and wanted to get home. So that was a really, that was a real, 24/7 in real-time crisis as well. There have been other issues on the agenda, like, for example, managing the expectations leading up to the Glasgow Climate Change Conference and steering Australia into what I think was a good landing place, although in the face of criticism from some quarters in the United Kingdom, we're being too slow about it. And various other things too, but it's been a busier time because of the events that I've described than I anticipated.
It strikes me that one of the contrasts between modern Australia and modern Britain at the moment is something quite ephemeral and seems to sort of boil down to a sense of national confidence. It's obviously part of our democratic fabric to be very self-reflexive and self-critical, but there has been a bit of a whiff of declinism around some of the narratives that have emerged about the Global Britain project, which I personally believe have been misplaced. It's also problematic in an age where liberal powers are genuinely facing existential threats from rising authoritarian nations. How do you think the UK could develop a more confident posture and a sort of sense of self and its liberal identity?
Well, I think that, particularly in the early part of my term, the great issue du jour was Brexit and the attempt to establish a British position that the Parliament would adopt in the negotiations with the EU. And it was quite shocking to me as a close observer of Parliament, as a member of the Australian Parliament myself for many years, to watch the system here almost having a heart attack with the seemingly intractable deadlock in the Commons, which couldn't be resolved by the usual way in which parliamentary systems resolve intractable deadlocks, that is by going to the country because of the Fixed Term Parliament Act. But I don't think, I wouldn't use the word declinist narrative to describe the last couple of years. I think there are people who are pessimistic, who didn't want Brexit to happen and refuse to see any good coming out of it. That's a reluctant or a pessimistic narrative. It's not a declinist narrative. I was here as a young man at that sort of high point of the declinist narrative at the beginning of the 1980s, before the Thatcher reforms took effect. When I arrived in Britain as a postgraduate student at Oxford at the beginning of the 1981 academic year, when Thatcher had recently been elected and before her very radical neoliberal economic reforms took hold, that was the high tide of the declinist narrative. And, on both sides of politics since the Second World War until the Thatcher Revolution, the art, as a number of commentators said, was to manage Britain into a respectable and genteel decline. Now, that was reversed at a lot of social cost, by the Thatcher reforms. She changed Britain so profoundly that her most successful Labour successor, Tony Blair, described himself as her legatee. So I think that post-Brexit, the global Britain is not a decline narrative. I think it is a conflicted narrative in which the bitter divisions over Brexit between those who wanted to leave and those who wanted to stay have not healed. People are reluctant to let them go, particularly people who are on the losing side of the referendum. And Britain is seeking to define exactly what global Britain means. And that's why the trade agreements, like the one with Australia, is so important to it.
How confident do you feel about the concept of the Western Alliance? Does that framework still feel relevant? And do you see this alliance being in good health moving forward? I'm particularly interested in your thoughts around the relationship with the United States and its recalibration of its global role, because this is a country with whom here in the UK we have a special relationship, but Australia also has a very special relationship with the United States. And it seems to me that the United States is in a period of quite considerable political dynamism at the moment. How do you conceive America's evolving role within that alliance, and what does that make you think about its health over the coming decade?
Well, let me turn specifically to America in a moment, but addressing the first part of your question, Sophia. What we saw at the end of during the Trump presidency, basically, was the convergence, towards the end of the second decade of the 21st century, shall we say. What we saw was the convergence of three very important things. One was the election of a president who basically went rogue and wasn't committed to the transatlantic relationship in a way that other American presidents, both sides of politics, had been. Secondly, you saw increasing heterogeneity of view among the European Union and the rise of, in states like Hungary and Poland, of essentially nationalist governments that didn't buy into the Western liberal consensus, but nevertheless completely bought in to the European project. So there was an emergent degree of internal challenge to the liberal consensus that the EU by and large represented. And then there are other parts of the EU, like parts of Spain, where there were separatist movements as well that complicated their politics. Thirdly, at the same time, you had Brexit, and the consequences of Brexit, the removal from the EU of the United Kingdom, one of the three main actors, and I would say a stabilising actor, which had obviously a huge impact. Now, any one of those phenomena or developments would have been important in itself. The convergence of all three at about the same time was obviously going to be hugely disruptive, and so it came to be. But what we have seen as a direct consequence of President Putin's very ill-advised, leave aside morally and legally shameful, but from a strategic point of view, very ill-advised invasion of Ukraine, is what has surprised a lot of people, and that is the very rapid galvanization of the West. We have a more internationalist, more orthodox American president. We have a United Kingdom that is starting to put the Brexit traumas behind it and establish a more regular modus vivendi with Europe. And we have, with a couple of exceptions, particularly Hungary, we have a European Union or European nation states that have spoken with, to some, surprising unanimity in response to Putin's threat, especially Poland. I mean, Poland was being, even 4 months ago, put in the same bracket as Hungary for obvious reasons because of its domestic politics. And yet no European nation has been so admired for its response, for example, to the refugee crisis, as Poland has been. So there's been a greater degree of cohesion among the European states than I think was expected. And the re-election of President Macron, I think, will contribute to that as well. Now, in relation to the United States, we need to see what happens, of course, in 2024. If there is elected to the White House either President Trump or a neo-Trumpian president, shall we say, somebody of that worldview who does not value NATO, does not value the Atlantic relationship as much as America traditionally has, then that will present a new set of challenges. But just for the time being, this is an unusual and precipitated by very egregious circumstances, but an unusual moment of harmony among the West.
Do you think that we currently have the right set of alliances and institutions for the Western world, for liberal powers to address the challenges that we're facing now?
Well, I mean, it's not geometry, you know. It's not about devising perfect shape. I mean, these alliances are the product of history, primarily. So I don't want to take a sort of purist view and say, well, you know, it'd be better if the alliances were structured a little differently. What I would say is that ultimately the convergence of like-mindedness on values, the identification of commonality of interests, and also the recognition of common enemies and threats broadly keeps these nations together. I think, though, and I would say this as an Australian, of course, one thing that is a good development is a much, much greater appreciation that the West is not about the Euro-Atlantic. That there is no more important nation in the West, for example, than Japan. Australia has become a much more important voice in the West than we used to be. And then there are other states as well But when we had the G7 last year, as you know, South Africa was invited, South Korea was invited. So I think we are broadening in a geographical sense our notion of the West as well.
There are some who are making the argument here in Westminster that the shocking events in Ukraine, Russia's invasion, and the sense that in the longer term we will be dealing with a much more actively hostile Russia and the sort of consequences of that for the European security framework make the kinds of investments that we have been seeking to prioritize in the Pacific security theatre more difficult, or certainly call them into question in a time particularly when we are dealing with pretty constrained government resources. What would you say to that posture?
Well, I think in a way I addressed that in my last answer. I completely disagree. I think that what the lessons of both the lessons that informed the integrated review, but the lessons of the last 2 months have both taught us is the importance of the liberal democracies across the globe being convergent and working in harmony and in alliance in the face of illiberal actors who don't respect international rules-based order and don't respect the values that we share. So far from saying that the integrated review got it wrong with the tilt to the Indo-Pacific, I actually think the integrated review got it just right. It didn't anticipate Ukraine, of course. Ukraine had nothing to do with it. But the broad strategic conception that there are global interests, not just Euro-Atlantic interests, that matter deeply to the United Kingdom is, in my view, correct.
What kind of role do you think Australia really wants from Britain in the Indo-Pacific?
As a partner, both a trading partner and a strategic partner. We accept that that as a military presence, Britain is going to be located in the Euro-Atlantic, of course. But nevertheless, Britain has a lot of moral authority in faraway places. One thing that rather bothers me is that there are some from the commentariat, possibly some even in the Foreign Office, who are almost guilty about Britain's imperial past and therefore think that notions like the Commonwealth should be added sotto voce. Can I tell you, among the small island states of the Southwest Pacific, Britain is loved. The Queen is loved. All of the majesty of the British state are admired in those small nations, which are now a very critical part of the world because they're an object of Chinese ambition. Britain should not underestimate its soft power in a lot of the small Commonwealth nations as the nation whose head of state is the head of the Commonwealth, and nowhere is that more so than in the Southwest Pacific.
Do you think that Britain should be looking to be playing a stronger role in an alliance such as the Quad?
Well, Britain's not a member of the Quad, and I suppose that goes to your earlier question of, are the alliances that are in the right shape? I know there is a discussion at the moment about the expansion of the Quad. Britain, of course, recently achieved dialogue partner status in ASEAN. Whether the Quad gets expanded into a broader strategic grouping is a conversation that is ongoing, but is not yet reached, I think, a point at which the Quad is ready for that. The trick with the Quad was to get a sufficient amount of buy-in, especially from India. We've got that buy-in from India now. It was one of the priorities of the Australian governments in which I served, the governments of Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, and some very deft and skillful diplomacy led by the former Foreign Minister, Julian Bishop, that really caused the Quad to merge into more than just essentially a concept in and into a real thing. Because it's early days, I think it's too soon to talk about the expansion of membership.
Do you think that Britain could be playing a role in the question of how we diversify India's defensive supply chains? Because at the moment it's extremely dependent on Russian supplied weapons.
Well, it sure is. I understand 98% of India's tanks come from Russia and 76% of its fighter planes come from Russia. And they rely for their operability on a ready supply of spare parts and maintenance capabilities. So that is not something that is going to happen anytime soon.
The Quad obviously in some ways is about a kind of rebalancing with a sort of eye to the rise of China. The UK's reset of its relations with China has taken place in your term.
Yes.
How meaningful do you feel that is, and where do you feel that there might still be room for improvement?
Improvement in what?
In the way in which we approach our relationship with China.
I think your settings in relation to China at the moment are much better than they were. I was talking to a member of your cabinet, I won't say whom, earlier in the year, and we were talking about the last 4 years. And he said to me, the most important thing your country has done for Britain in the 4 years you've been here is not the free trade agreement, even though that's very important. It's not even AUKUS, even though that's very important. The most important thing you have done, Australia has done in the last few years, is to alert us to the real nature of China and elevate concern about awareness of the concerns we ought to have about Chinese policy significantly up the British foreign policy agenda.
Do you think we have sufficiently gone through the process of that reckoning, or where do you see us in terms of the lifespan of that reckoning? Are we still very early days, or do you think that?
No, I don't think you're early days. I think the tipping point probably was the Huawei decision or the reversal of the original, I think, plainly mistaken Huawei decision. But I think there's an attitudinal adjustment required here too. There is a large element of the Whitehall establishment that is still hesitant about being too front-footed in relation to China because of concerns about trade. I understand that, but I remind those people that even though Australia has been more forward-leaning than the United Kingdom has been in defending liberal democratic values, and in doing so, attracting a lot of criticism from China. China remains our largest trading partner by far. I mean, I don't think that's fully appreciated by important elements of your foreign policy establishment and foreign policy makers, that it's possible to stand up for yourself as a liberal democracy and stand up for other liberal democracies and stand up for the rule of international law in places like the South China Sea and still have a lucrative trading relationship with China. The great art of Australian foreign policy for decades has been to manage to walk and chew gum, as it were, at the same time. China gets it that a liberal democracy like Australia, whose key Pacific strategic partner is the United States, will not share its values. That doesn't mean that it's not prepared to recognise where its mercantile and commercial interests lie and to balance those two to be in strategic competition with a nation while at the same time maintaining a healthy trading relationship with them is something Australia has managed to achieve. Now, diplomatically, the relationship is choppy at the moment, I know that. But the trading relationship is still our biggest trading relationship by far. And the fear that Britain's position as a global trading partner, a global trading nation, will be fundamentally compromised by the exclusion of British goods from the Chinese market if Britain stands up for itself as a liberal democracy, stands up for other liberal democracies, is a misplaced fear. But I think it still does affect the thinking of a lot of your policymakers.
Do you feel that Australia's trading model in that respect, with China remaining its largest trading partner, does that feel sustainable in the longer term?
Well, as long as we've got vast quantities of commodities in particular that China wants to buy, yes.
Does it leave Australia vulnerable? Potentially, we need to move into a space where the kinds of sanctions instruments that are being applied to Russia right now could theoretically be applied to China.
Well, I think there's a very big assumption built in, unspoken assumption built into that question. So I'm not going to follow you down that particular rabbit hole, Sophia. But the time being, I just make the point that a nation's strategic interests and its trading interests can be congruent without being the same.
Along the hypothetical scenario, then, do you think that Russia's shocking invasion of Ukraine, does that change the calculation for China about any potential incursions towards Taiwan?
It's very interesting to see the way China is watching what happens in Ukraine. I know Taiwan pretty well. I've been there several times. The Taiwanese, I would expect, would be, should there be an aggressor on their soil, every bit as ferocious in defending their soil as the Ukrainians have been in defending theirs. And don't forget that Taiwan it's not a question of rolling troops across the border. Taiwan is a very mountainous.
Yes, there's a lot about the landscape physically and conceptually that is rather different. We're going to open up to the room for some questions, but I can't help but ask one final question of you. Do you think that Australia will become a republic within your lifetime?
No, I don't. I don't. I myself don't think Australia becoming a republic. That I'm not answering a question out of a sort of verbalized wish. The reason, there's a very practical reason. And there's an analog here with Scottish independence. There's a large body of opinion in Australia want to be a republic. A large body of opinion that doesn't want to be. And neither of them is a majority. And then there's a floating group in the middle who think that it sounds like a good idea in theory, but when you look at the practical consequences, it just gets too hard. I think that's the case with Scottish independence, and I think it's somewhat similar politics at work in a utterly different environment, on a totally different issue for Australia and republicanism. You see, Australia has a written constitution. To amend the constitution requires a special majority, which has to be a majority of people in the majority of states, and there are only 6 states, so there you go. It's very difficult to amend the Australian Constitution. When the then Prime Minister Paul Keating brought this debate on in the 1990s, those who opposed Australia becoming a republic demanded that the Republicans expose their model. And there was then a big fight among the Republicans as to what the right model should be. And John Howard, who was the most cunning politician I ever put Brandis into, immediately seized this and said, well, you know, his mantra was, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You can't tell us why you can't even agree on your alternative model, and you can't, other than in a sort of symbolic and rhetorical way, show us what's wrong with the current system of government in Australia, then why would you vote for it? So in Australia, any debate on a republic almost of necessity defaults to a debate on whether or not the current constitutional arrangements in Australia, in a mechanical sense, work. And most constitutional lawyers think that we'll have endless criticisms of them, but to the person in the street, they think they work just fine.
There we go. I'd like to open up to questions now. If you could put up your hand, if you can state your name and your affiliation as well. You don't have mics, so if you can just project with alacrity, that would be wonderful. So we'll start with the gentleman with the glasses here, and if you can please sign up for your questions. So,
yeah, George Bills from the Times. We've seen Russia use hypersonic missiles in Ukraine. We've seen China test them as well. Earlier this month, the UK, Australia, and the US announced this joint partnership. Can you outline the threat of hypersonic missiles? Is it fair to say we're outgunned at the moment? And if I may, just on that Republican point, to answer was so interesting, you talked generally about how it would be quite hard to sort of do it feasibly. But how personally do you feel, having had an affiliation with the UK since the dating back to the 1980s? Do you support the monarchy, and would you like to see Prince Charles as the Australian head of state?
hypersonic missiles.
Well, let me deal with the second bit first. So, I think Prince Charles would be a very fine monarch, a very fine head of state of Australia. He loves Australia. He's been there 17 times. He has a true emotional connection with Australia. And as I've found in this role, is absolutely deeply felt sense of care for Australia is evident, for example, from his reaction to the bushfires a couple of years ago, illustrated that. Now, as to my own personal views, I'm a person who thinks that, that, as I described really in the earlier answer, that the status quo works fine. To alter the status quo would cause a lot. It wouldn't happen. It's not worth the fight, and it would cause a lot of hurt and offence to millions and millions and millions of Australians who are actually quite devoted to the elder Australians, in particular, who are quite devoted to the traditional Australian constitutional monarchy. So not in any ideological sense, but for those essentially practical reasons, I don't favour a move to a republic. Coming to the hypersonics questions, obviously, it is always extremely perilous when one nation or group of nations develops a capability in a particular weapon system that is greater than the capability of nations who are potentially its rivals. I'll leave it to the engineers to comment on whether or not that is in fact the case. With hypersonics, there is certainly a lot of, as you're aware, I'm sure, a lot of commentary that China in particular has got ahead of the United States in relation to hypersonics capability. It is certainly one of the purposes of the AUKUS Pact to develop capability. And hypersonics, as the announcement we referenced, is an example, is one of the areas in which we're going to work together to do so. And it's very important to make that point because AUKUS has been seen as being all about Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. That's not what it's all about. It's a much broader and deeper partnership than that. people speak of Pillar 1 of AUKUS, which is the submarines, which are, they're the first item on the agenda, as it were. But Pillar 2 is about the development of all the other capabilities that we work on together, which hypersonics is one. And to those who conceived of and designed AUKUS, Pillar 2 is just as important as Pillar 1.
Wonderful. Okay, we'll take a few more questions. So we've got a gentleman right down the back.
Thank you, High Commissioner. We have this meeting and Mr. Indonesia. So I would like to bring G20 to this conversation about alliances and liberal order. It has been said that when the G20 was informally established back in 2008, it was sort of a recognition that then rules-based order with regards to economic issues was not politically feasible. Now, taking this into account and also the diverse nature of G20 membership, do you think that G20 has a role to play in supporting liberalism, or even is it equipped to do that? Thank you.
Well, it's a great question, particularly given that liberalism means so many different things to so many different people. So let's talk. Let me sort of try and narrow down the question, if I may, to what is one of the fundamental purposes of a liberal global order, and that is respect for the rule of law. Now, I don't think respect for the rule of law in international law is a Western notion alone. The International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court are multi-jurisdictional, multi-systemic, global legal institutions. And it's disrespect for their rulings, disrespect for the principles of international law that is the problem here. I know that there is a narrative developed by some that public international law is a Western construct imposed upon non-Western nations. That's nonsense. In its modern shape, public international law and the rulings of the ICJ and the proceedings of the ICC capture a global legal order, that it is the obligation and ultimately in the interests of all nations to see upheld. Now, coming to what you have to say about the G20. Obviously, when a G20 nation commits such an egregious and contumelious breach of international law as the Russian invasion of Ukraine is, then there has to be a discussion about the appropriateness of that country sitting as a member of the G20. And I don't want to go down that path. I don't want to express a view, because this is a conversation, there's a very important conversation that has a way to go. There are certain very important international fora. For example, as you know, the Human Rights Council, from which Russia has been expelled for that very reason. But does the egregiously unlawful behaviour of a G20 member mean that the whole conception of the G20 doesn't work anymore? No.
Let's take some more questions. We've got one more hand springing up. Peter, you had your hand up earlier, did you?
Yeah, I won't stand up because I can't, there's not enough room. So I'm showing a strategy which supports, Strategy International supports the British foreign policy. It's always really healthy for countries to realise how other countries look at them. I went to Australia about the same time as you arrived here as a postgrad. And I sometimes think people of my generation here around Westminster think of Australia's view of the UK as very redolent of that era, where people in Australia still call the UK home, where there was a very much stronger, I call it Anglo-Saxon connection, notwithstanding huge diasporas like the Greeks and others in Australia. You're going back, and I just wonder if you could give us a sort of a warts and all view of how you think Aussies, modern Australia, looks at the UK. And if I can frame that with one example, there seems to be a presumption in the UK press that when the nuclear submarine contracts are given out, they'll come here. Why wouldn't they? Instead of the States. That's an example. I'm not asking you to comment on who gets the contract. So Australia's view of the UK, sort of a
Australia's view of the UK is very favourable. One of our 2 or 3 main foreign policy think tanks in Australia is, I'm sure many in this room would know, is an institute called the Lowy Institute. Every year, for several years now, they've conducted within Australia, among the general public, a public attitude survey on foreign policy for at least the last 10 years. In every year that survey has been conducted, one of the questions they have posed is, which of these countries, from a list of about 35 countries, do you trust the most to act responsibly in the world? In every single year that survey has been conducted, the answer has, the country that has scored the highest score has either been Britain or Britain and Japan in a tie. Last year's Lowy Institute survey had the answer to that question show once again Britain came first among all the countries in the world in the eyes of the Australians as a trustworthy and responsible global actor, with an affirmative response of 87%. And that was an increase on the previous year of 4%. So, and one thing that has really struck me in the 4 years I've been here is the self-lacerating tone of so much commentary about Britain. Certainly in the eyes of Australians, British esteem in the world for a whole variety of reasons, including the generosity of your humanitarian assistance, the prestige of your institutions, the cultural power of your language, and the world leading nature of so many things in this country. The trustworthiness of Britain as a global actor generally, whether it's in the Middle East or in other fora, today, of course, in Ukraine, commands respect. And I just wish that the self-lacerating classes in Britain would realise that the world respects their own country a lot more than one.
excellent. Can you stay and not go back?
And I should just intend that the BFPG does the UK version of those public opinion surveys, including coordinating with Lowy on various questions. And we have actually mirrored several of those questions here. We're publishing that next month. But we are rather more cynical about all of our global relationships here in the UK than the Australians are, which I think says something about our character. Let's take a bunch of questions together. I'm aware of time. So 2 gentlemen here, and then let's see how much time you've got for other questions. Yeah.
So great to hear your thoughts. My name is Ed Robinson, I'm Global Defence Lead at Turner Towns and Professional Services Business. AUKUS, is it going to deliver with the volume of people skills that are required to meet the speed of technological evolution that we're seeing rise from our future potential opponents? And if you just look at the base issue, there's capacity issues in production in the US, there's capacity issues in production in the UK. And if you look at the UK, the PWR3 that go in the boat that replaces Astute, it's the same reactor core that goes in SMR reactor, civil nuclear. And you're not a civil nuclear country either. So there's a raft of people skill issues around there. They're going to be a real anchor to delivery of the outcome of AUKUS. Any ideas on how that's going to get solved?
Well, in a way, in a very elegant way, if I may say so, you've restated the conundrum of defence procurement always, that the lead times are so long that the earliest delivery date is beyond the event horizon. That's the problem with defence procurement, we all know, but the delivery date is beyond the event horizon. So what do? You've got to make the best possible assessments you could make of anticipated future needs. In relation to capacity constraints, the people who will be operating these submarines, for example, I mean, they're in primary school, some of them, because the submarines are not expected to come into service for well over a decade. But training up the personnel, it's not as if the body of technical knowledge doesn't exist. When it comes, so that capacity constraints of which you speak are not constraints on intellectual capacity, they're constraints on physical and engineering capacity. One thing you didn't say, by the way, as you didn't reference Osborne shipyards in Adelaide, which are a brand new state-of-the-art shipyard of global, potentially global significance, and they anchor a highly developed defence and space technology sector within Australia, especially around the city of Adelaide, which has a tradition of being leading edge in that particular industry sector or sectors. So let's let the engineers do what engineers do. But these capabilities, and it's not just the subs, I mean, it's like the other capabilities which we speak to, are going to be developed as fast as human ingenuity and the will to produce them can make them.
And there's been huge investment at Osborne, but of course it's not a nuclear regulated site.
No, that's
and neither
true.
is your east or west coast.
No, that's
facilities over
true.
which they're operating.
That's true.
And that alone is a massive investment.
Noted.
Okay.
A point that Mr. Turnbull has not been slow to make.
Thanks. Chris McKeon from the Press Association. Picking up on your answer to this gentleman's question and also your answers on China and British soft power, is it your assessment that Britain in general and Dutch governments and foreign office in particular are too timid?
I think there has been, which is atypical for this country, I think, but for understandable reasons in recent years, a loss of confidence. Now, why did a politician with a particular style of Boris Johnson do so well? Because even Labor, traditional Labor voters said, whatever if they thought about Boris Johnson, all the things they didn't like about him, one thing that connected with them that meant that was particularly puissant in 2019 was the sense of confidence that he projected in a country that had seemed to lose its confidence and almost lose its way. So I think the issue is confidence rather than timidity.
The gentleman in the green shirt. Yep.
Hello, Jack Honeywell with Power Communications. We specialise in UK Middle East relations. So some of the states that were perceived to be sort of allies or partners didn't respond in the way the West would like to the invasion of Ukraine. A lot of them are trying to tread that path between China and the US. So my question really is, do you think the war in Ukraine, as well as rising tensions with China, will lead the UK and the West to reevaluate some of these relationships? So I'm thinking of states in the Gulf, Israel, India, and other states similar to that.
I think it's a very important question, but I think it's very difficult to give a general answer to it because it depends upon the dynamic of the relation, the particular bilateral relationship. Now, let's stick with India, for example, which I've already referred to. The Indian Defence Forces are extremely weighted towards Russian kit. And I think one has to understand why in those circumstances India's reaction is going to be more circumspect than the reaction of a country like the United Kingdom or the United States, or for that matter, Australia. So I think it's foolish to overgeneralize without regard to the particular inevitable constraints that particular states are subject to, and pretend that there's no such thing as sort of a more nuanced response of necessity from some than by others.
There was a gentleman with your check shirt. Did you want to ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Richard Evans, I work at a software company called Palantir. What options do countries like Australia and New Zealand have in responding to the growing Chinese presence in the Southwest Pacific? I'm thinking specifically of the Solomon Islands. Beyond the statements that have been made, what options, whether in terms of development funding, military, diplomatic or otherwise, does Australia have in responding to that growing, potentially even military presence?
Well, Australia is alert to this and has been for a long time. Australia has been the most generous donor of foreign aid to those nations for a long time, and the Southwest Pacific has been one of the most active areas of our diplomacy for a long time. But there's no doubt, you're right, that there is a contest now going on in what had been largely an uncontested space until recent years, in which China is seeking to project influence in quite an aggressive, diplomatically aggressive way in the Southwest Pacific. It remains the case that Australia is the partner of choice of those smaller nations. It remains the case, going back to the point I made earlier in a different context, that they're member states of the Commonwealth, and they hugely value their connection here more than people in the United Kingdom realise that they do. So the levers of soft power, as well as the levers of development aid, and the traditional tools of diplomacy are all deployed.
We're nearly out of time, so I'd like to finish with one final question. We've talked a lot about what do you think Britain could learn from Australia and has been learning during your time. What do you think Australia can learn from Britain?
Well, I think we can learn a lot from each other, and we do. I mean, it's almost a how long is a piece of string sort of question, Sophia. Maybe I can answer it this way. It's interesting to me to observe the different way in which public discussion of big issues is conducted and compare Britain with Australia. The United Kingdom has a much more, and this is just my impression, but it's my sense that the United Kingdom has a much more front of mind sense of its own past. And so many public debates, particularly about global politics, for understandable reasons, are conducted by reference to similar past events. We're seeing this in the Ukraine at the moment, in which President Zelensky is, with extreme cleverness, evoking every Churchillian trope that he can whenever he talks to Boris Johnson. That's a good thing, but it can also be the self-limiting. This country is both enriched and burdened by its history. Australia is in a way the opposite. Australia, modern Australia, is a nation that's always thinking about what happens next. It's more future focused in its discourse. It's less encumbered by a sense of legacy. And that can be both a weakness and a strength, but it's a different mode of discourse. And I think observing the way each other deal with the past and the future is something we can learn from each other.
That is a wonderful point for us to close today. George, you've been so generous and thoughtful and candid and erudite in exactly the way we've come to expect from all of your contributions to Westminster life while you've been here. And just to say again that we've been watching, and feeling your presence very much here in Westminster, and we're very sad that you will be leaving us soon. But you've made such a tangible impact here, not just in terms of policy outcomes, but I think culture as well. And the bilateral relationship is in a much better place as a result of that. So all that's left for me to do is ask you to please thank His Excellency in the normal way.